The Noah Bud Ogle family sold it to Matt Whittle, who was a nurseryman, and this was about in late 20s, mid-20s to late 20s, and being a nurseryman, he developed a lot of nursery stock items, such as the boxwood over there, and selling them out to various people that were seeking either native plants or cultivated. He thought it was such an entanglement of growth with the multiplicity of streams that the brook came natural as well as did the density of growth. So he renamed it Jungle Brook.
Glenn, what did mills mean to these people?
Well, in the minds of a lot of people that lived in the Smoky Mountain in days before good roads come into being, as well as electricity and all, a mill was a survival trait, but is also a prestige mark to the point that if you owned a mill, it was equivalent to owning an impressive car, I guess, by today's standards. And mills like you find here on Mill Creek in early America, most streams were named first, and it was not uncommon to name streams after animals or natural or topographic features.
We need to talk sort of good, but like only the elite would own a mill?
No, mills were easily constructed, so
about everybody.
Tub mills could be owned by anybody.
How many different kinds of mills were there?
Tub mills were the dominant because they were the easiest constructed. The more elaborate mills were the overshots, or tub mills could be elaborate if they were big stones.
Like an overshot mill is what we normally think of as a water wheel.
Right, the picturesque type mill.
And then is that all there? Was there any other kinds?
The pounding mill was used in areas where there was not much water, and it was kind of an afterrunner of the person that would be pounding the corn by hand.
And people had to pay a toll to use a mill?
Generally, the mill toll was 1 bushel is 8 gallons, so 1 out of 8 was the toll rendered by the miller. That was not always absolute because most millers took in consideration hardship of families and widows. They would extract less than that.
What's mill day?
Mill day, that was associated mostly with custom milling, and that would be the type where definitely a toll was extracted, and that was the larger mills, where it became a common thing for people to know that Ogle was going to operate his mill, or Watson was going to operate his mill on Wednesday or Saturday. My father had a mill. Saturday was all his mill. It was always the mill day for my family, and it was a joyous time. People would come, sit around, swap stories, sing, bring musical instruments, whittle, spit.
Spit around, and were they sort of keeping beat to the mill?
They'd do some jogging, yeah, I remember that. And of course, as kids, I recall many times we'd be playing either marbles or any kind of games that would be vogue of the day.
What would they use the meal for? We talked about that earlier.
Cornmeal was a staple item of all mountain homes. You could use it in a various method, even from breakfast through supper. Mush would be the breakfast meal. Quite often, if it was left over, you could use it kind of comparable in taste, a lot like grits. Usually, the mush was a supper.
How would you make mush?
I remember mostly my mother making it when we were growing up. The cornmeal was sifted to get the bran out of it, and poured just as what she would call scalding water on it and stirred it up, and that then was buttered. If you preferred to put sugar in it, most of the time sweetening though was honey and sorghum.
Was that night meal?
Night meal. And of course this was, what was left over was always made into mush pancakes for breakfast. But it's hominy. You could use it in addition to making hoe cakes, quick hoe cake on top of the stove.
What's a hoe cake?
Hoe cake was just a small, you might want to call it a fritter, just quickly mixed up into a batter, poured on top of the stove directly or into a little pan, and then it would bake quickly rather than heat up an oven.
And then the bread, they made everything, all the major meals with the cornbread was at dinner.
Right. The cornbread was on the table 3 times a day for most part.
How would your mama keep it warm?
Well, this is particularly in summer months when you didn't want to heat the house up at supper time, but for the evening meal, you'd have to heat up for breakfast, of course, and then again a noon meal. But baking the cornmeal for supper, you'd bake it at noon, and you'd wrap it up in a clean towel, and usually was put in between the mattresses or in the bed between the quilts and blankets and stuff that would be there to keep it so you'd have kind of warm rather than heat up a oven at supper time.
What was the thing you were telling me about not shucking the corn, but if it got too hard?
Well, usually in the fall, and this was anywhere from about mid-August on, when your corn would be too hard for roasting ears, and again, your last year's corn was probably getting kind of used up, you would revert to a source of cornmeal for the table, which would be called, we called it gridded, but it's actually a grater. A grater would be about a piece of tin that was about a foot, 12 inches wide, stretched over a 2x4, and could be about 20 inches long, and you'd just be pegged full of nail holes. And you would just grit that corn or grate it, and it would back down to the cob, and then you would just put it in a bread pan and bake it either on top of the stove, or most of the time it was baked in the oven, and gritted bread by name.
Gritted bread. Was you used meal more than you did flour?
Flour, as a rule, was kind of a delicacy. It was usually reserved for Sundays and breakfasts and special occasion like birthday cakes and pies and that kind of thing. So
you'd use meal for biscuits?
No, cornmeal was always served in relationship for breakfast for a lot of families because a lot of people preferred it, but biscuits always had to be made from flour, either whole wheat or sometimes out of rye. Now, they grew rye in the mountains, but wheat had to be taken out of that after it was combined and selected. It had to be taken to either Pigeon Forge or directly into Sevierville. And now it was ground into flour and then was brought back to the families from whence the grain wheat came from.
What did a mill mean to people around here? I mean, was it something like a birdhouse, or was it more like
Mills, it was a gathering place. Now, mills were a gathering place many times when you weren't really grinding corn. It was a gathering place for people to talk on rainy days, on days when you didn't have anything else to do, but definitely on those mill days when a person knew that their neighbor was going to be grinding cornmeal, they could always go down and swap talk. And it was a happy gathering place, but again, it was one of those first items that had to be constructed when you conquered a part of the wilderness. A mill was almost a second nature to building. You might build your dwelling house first, but you certainly went into building that mill because you needed that mill for a source of bread.
Bread. How much bread would a family need? Like, there's all different types and kinds of mills with basically sizes. If you only had 1 or 2 children, did it work like that?
Well, I don't know the acreage. It's I'd say anywhere from a family, let's say of 5 or 6. I think probably 10 acres of corn would be plenty for you, but you got to consider your cows and your mules. You had to feed them too. This is one reason why a lot of people got to constructing their own mills, particularly the little tub mills. Rather than pay toll to the custom millers, it was more economical to get you some stones and whittle out or have somebody to chisel out those grooves and make your own mill and grind it at your own pace and own convenience.
When you say people gathered, was it like 3 or 4, or I mean, whole families would come, or was it like a church social or shucking corn, or?
Mostly men folk gathering and young boys. It was never, I don't recall too many women. Now let's be back up there. My grandma Frankie, she went by the name the Frankie Mill because my great-grandfather Harrison Ogle died early, and she continued to operate the mill, as did many women that was left to mill. Women could operate the mill. It was not a difficult thing, but for gathering days, on mill days, it's mostly men and young boys that would gather around and call it a festive occasion and just shop talking.
The shucking of the corn, that's sort of a fall harvest idea or theme. What was that? What did it entail?
The fall brought on a lot of festivities, and one of them was corn husking, where you'd actually gather the corn from the stalk. But after you got it into the cribs, you would also have another occasion for socializing by having corn shucking parties, and this would be an occasion where young people could have opportunity to fellowship one with another, and it was always considered an annual anticipated community affair.
What do you mean fellowship? You mean like you might get a red ear?
Oh yes, the red ears was a common anticipated good luck charm, because red ears was not always, well, they were few and far between, but it was always a mountain custom, I guess, and across the country, the first one that shucked, if it's a man, a boy shucked the ear, he got to pick his girl that he wanted to kiss. If the girl shucked one, she got to select the man that she wanted to kiss her. So it was a...
Did you ever remember that?
Oh, yes.
Did you ever get a red ear?
Most of us that grew up in the 30s and pre-park days, before we had good roads, most of these farms were self-contained, and we had corn shucking parties, even up in the mid-40s.
Okay. They get in there?
Okay, we got a real bright...
Glenn,
did hunker down.
Hunker down there. Did, I mean, like teenagers would, like Bill Landry's corn crops in, you all are invited all to come over to my house and shuck corn. The people would come.
Time hung heavy on mountain families, and when an invitation was come out to help a neighbor cover his barn or shuck his corn, there was usually a good turnout. And corn shucking, there was usually an activity reserved for the teenagers in the courting group, not the married groups. They had other things. They'd be peeling apples or shelling peas, perhaps. But we had pea shelling party for teenagers too.
But they'd come and everybody'd sit around and shuck corn and talk, make Google eyes at each other.
Right. Sing maybe some mountain ballads. You might, instead of having somebody shucking corn, you might have a couple over there with a fiddle and a banjo keeping tune, entertaining the others and singing while the other groups could be singing with them.
You think all of that's sort of part of the mystery and the mystique around the mill? Those kinds of occurrences and thoughts? What does a mill really mean? That's what I'm trying to ask.
A mill, to me, it's a survival item for mountain people.
I mean, does it go into ritual too? Is it part of the ritual? You know, the good memories you have about corn shucking, is that all mill related and that kind of thing? It's a machine, isn't it?
It's a machine, and it is a ritual associated with a custom that did provide an outlet of socializing, but also provided good memories. I think most people that had any attachment at all to a mountain mill would vouch that it probably embraces some of their strongest, most beautiful memories.
Because of the people who gathered around?
The fellowship. My father-in-law also he told me one time that the mill was also a gathering place for sharing your aches and pains, and somebody older than you might tell you what to take for the ailment that you have. Tooth pulling was not an uncommon thing in some mills, so I'm told. My father-in-law said that was the time when the miller kept a lot of tools, so if there was somebody had a loose tooth, he could also become dubbed in as the dentist. So I mean, there was more than just milling. Music and entertainment and fellowship, I guess, is a basic line that people had with the mill. The attachment of community life. It's good.
Ben, do you remember about the
corn shelling too? That came after the corn
shelling.
Well, usually though, you didn't shell the corn all at once. You shucked it and put it in bins, but you shelled it at a weekly. Usually, you had to go to the mill at least once a week. And if you had a big family, you might have to go too, but if you took a bushel to mill on mill day, let's say Saturday, by the next Saturday, the old mill barrel was empty. So corn shelling usually was a Friday night activity, or
I'm talking about a different corn sheet. Before your time. We used to take a big wagon sheet down, you know, and go to a place and shell all their corn out.